Hi, my name is Durey Kim. I am a research scientist here at NEST, and I will be introducing the test case titled Real-World Evidence Analysis for Pre-Market and Post-Approval Studies of Annular Closure Devices. Next slide. To start, I'd like to introduce the panel participants. First, we'll be hearing from the submitting organization by the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Intrinsic Therapeutics, Jacob Einhorn. Then we'll be hearing from the principal scientist of this test case from HealthCore, Kevin Haynes. And lastly, we'll get FDA's perspective from the Office of Orthopedic Devices, or OHC6, by David Huang. To kick off the review of this test case, I'll provide a brief overview of the study. The study was completed just past October of last year and utilized HealthCore's administrative claims data environment to look at barricade annular closure implant device in the orthopedic space, which are used to prevent spinal disc herniation. Next slide. What was attractive about this test case was that it was one of the first US population-based studies to investigate post-discectomy outcomes as they relate to re-imaging for symptomology, reoperation, or hospital readmittance. This project leverages claims data to explore possibility of supporting a post-approval study in marketing in the US. In terms of the importance to the medical device ecosystem at NEST, it was able to explore available information on the total product life cycle of the study device, as the proposed work was to establish the potential to initiate surveillance within the US and to showcase how administrative claims data can support the characterization of the target population and follow members longitudinally for device outcomes. In our role here at NEST, we were able to help in the communication and coordination between the test case team and submitting organization. And we were able to support the project through streamlining the completion of milestones and reporting requirements through the creation of deliverable templates within the project team. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Jacob.
Thanks, Durey. Appreciate it. And it's exciting to be here, at least virtually, with all of you. And you can go to the next slide. I know everybody here is involved with medical devices, research, clinical treatment, regulatory oversight in some form or fashion, but to bring us into the particular clinical space that we're involved in, as Durey mentioned, we're trying to help improve lumbar discectomy outcomes. And lumbar discectomy is a surgery that's performed on patients with bulging or herniated discs. Patients have radiating pain, numbness, or weakness, and the vast majority of patients with these symptoms resolve without surgery, but close to 500,000 patients a year in the US alone have a discectomy surgery. And in this surgery, the surgeon removes the quote-unquote offending material, the bulging or extruded disc material, and any loose fragments. But typically, patients leave the operating room with a hole in their disc. Lumbar discectomy is a pretty successful surgery, but outcomes can be improved. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, you see a literature review that was done that shows a pretty high reoperation rate is what's charted here over time, roughly 10% at 2 years, 20% at 10 years. And this risk is not evenly distributed across the population. And this is the key point that led to the founding of our company and our interest in clinical data. In particular, patients with large holes in their disc are at higher risk of failure, higher risk of recurrence of symptoms, and higher risk of reoperation. And it's these patients, this minority of patients that have large holes in their disc who represent a majority of the failures. And these are the patients whose outcomes we're trying to focus on improving. Next slide, please. So this is our device. It wasn't involved in the study at all, but just to give you some idea of what we're trying to do and therefore our interest in the data. It's a permanent implant designed to block holes in the disc that remain after a discectomy surgery. and it's indicated for a very particular subset of discectomy patients. Too long to go into in detail here, but there are various labeling limitations. We're particularly focused on the patients with large defects, single level surgeries at the lowest two discs, L4-5 and L5-S1. Next slide. So our interest, the reason we submitted a test case back in 2018, even though we fell into the pre-market group of studies, this was not intended, not linked to any FDA review activity, not intended to support any particular submission or labeling expansion. But prior to our PMA approval in 2019, and which in the category of timing is everything, we got our PMA supplement approved on March 17th last year, right as elective surgery was being shut down. But prior to PMA approval, all of our data came from outside the US. And so we had a very strong interest in understanding what sort of real world evidence might be available in the US. We knew that data on the size of the hole in the disc would not be available, but we wanted to know if we could get meaningful outcomes and cost data from the broader discectomy population, which, if available, could potentially provide support or reference for future pre-market applications or potential reference for marketing materials. And I don't want to. I don't want to steal the thunder of my partners who are going to present shortly, but I guess I'm going to. Our conclusion was yes, absolutely. The proof of concept is actually absolutely there, but to understand how the outcomes and costs are distributed across this very heterogeneous population of discectomy patients, we would need to create or identify an additional data set and link it to really identify and assess our specific population of interest, the patients who are at the highest risk of these expensive and potentially debilitating outcomes. Next slide. And here you see in detail our labeling indication, and obviously there's further warnings and precautions, and you can go to the link or the QR code to get all of that detail. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Kevin Haynes from HealthCore to go into more detail on the project.
Thank you, Jacob. As was mentioned, so my name is Kevin Haynes. I'm a principal scientist at HealthCore. Just a little bit of background on HealthCore. HealthCore is the research subsidiary of Anthem, and we have access to administrative claims data. So, you know, the types of things that we all have in our wallets with the insurance card, which as Jacob mentioned, you know, did give some limitations to this study, but I think that we offered an opportunity to apply some real-world observational data to the question that Intrinsic had on Annular device. Next slide. So the objective of this study, as already mentioned, was really to conduct this retrospective study in an administrative claims data environment and really compare this reoperation and reimaging rates in a real-world population. As was already mentioned, we couldn't get at the size of the annular defect based on administrative claims data, thus sort of lacking that granularity in our data. However, we were able to sort of close some of the gaps in the literature, at least on understanding what our real-world data environment could be used to support the types of observational studies that will likely need to transpire in this space. Next slide. So we'll just talk a little bit about our methods. Next slide. So again, this was a descriptive study, and we were really focused on developing this computable phenotype using our HealthCore integrated research database, which is administrative claims data, utilizing CPT codes, ICD-9 and ICD-10 procedure codes to identify the population eligible for this device and really characterize the post-operative healthcare outcomes and the utilization, including these postoperative imaging, postoperative readmission, and reoperation, so sort of following the index event. Next slide. So now the fun part, we're going to talk about some results, and we can probably dive into some of these deeper during the discussion following David's presentation. Next slide. So in our Anthem database, which is a collection of 14 commercial Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, including Medicare Advantage patients, we have over 77 million patients in the database. Obviously, in a consort diagram, sort of the first step is to get at those patients with one or more claims for disectomy during our index period. And we treated that first claim as the index date. And that netted us with 364,000 members who had a first claim index date. We then further limited that in this first piece to look at those who had a CPT code on their index date. That had 211,000. And then, as we do in a lot of claims databases, we want to look back 12 months to ensure that that's a baseline or index event. And that had us with 157,000 members who, based on enrollment criteria, had an index date encounter, first claim with a CPT code for disectomy. And then we further subcategorized that out into the 109,000 after we excluded those who had the revision codes on index, obviously indicating that may not have been their first encounter for lumbar disectomy. And then we further detailed into those with ICD-10 procedure codes and ICD-9 procedure codes on index. And so these became our sort of base populations to then do the characterization work. Next slide. Going back to that 364,000, we then took a look at those who only had ICD-9 or ICD-10 diagnostic claims, procedure claims at index, and that netted us with 32,000 and 171,000 respectively. Again, applying a 12-month pre-index continuous enrollment, you can see the numbers that we got in the end: 12,000 for the ICD-10 time period and 54,000 for the ICD-9 period. The ICD-9 codes, I'll just remind folks, are not as granular in getting at where the lumbar disectomy is. So you actually then have to use some ICD-10 diagnostic codes to sort of further narrow that population down. And so that's why you see a greater drop in the 122 to 54,000. But now we'll go over sort of the discussion of the results, both the characterizations and the outcomes. Next slide. So jumping back, this is our 109,000 overall. We further subcategorized those in index events into inpatient and outpatient, and did some descriptive analyses on the gender and the age age categorization as presented here, as well as the Charleston comorbidity, which you can see this is a population that's relatively healthy, recognizing that Charleston comorbidity less than 1 is healthy, 2 and 3 indicates more comorbidities. And then you can see we further assess post-index imaging, and you can see the rates here, as well as then post-index operation. And you can see these percentages are roughly in line with what Jacob had presented in his overview slide. Recognize that the follow-up time for most patients within an administrative claims environment is 2 to 3 years, and recognize we had mandated that 1-year baseline period. So most of these people are being followed for 1, at most 2, some 3 years post, and these percentages are in line with what Jacob had presented. Next slide. Focusing now into the population that had those CPT codes, but also had the ICD-10 or ICD-9 codes of interest. Again, further subsetting into the inpatient and the outpatient results are largely in line with those procedures that were only categorized at the CPT level. Next slide. this now takes a look at those individuals who only had ICD-10 on the left and ICD-9 on the right codes at index date. Again, similar percentages here, a little bit lower on the ICD-10 environment. I think that these just reflect a different coding practice of not having billed for the CPTs in a different patient population, and then slightly different on the ICD-9. We can get into some of that on the discussion, but again, largely, as Jacob mentioned, this was so descriptive, but beginning to really just showcase the ability of administrative claims data to identify relevant patient populations and characterize them both in a baseline environment as well as then longitudinal follow-up. One of the strengths is at least longitudinal follow-up across healthcare systems, so we would capture any post-index imaging or post-index operations across healthcare delivery systems as opposed to EHR data, which might be limited to just the data at a given center. Next slide. We can look to the panel as we discuss this. Again, as we know, it was not possible to determine the annular defect size with administrative claims data, which we sort of knew going in, but we were able to use our real-world data environment to assess code combinations and define both a pre-index period as well as then define outcomes in a post-index period. And so, you know, the ability for real-world data to close some of the gaps in evidence is here, and I look forward to some of the discussion from our panel and really some of the thoughts from David Wong at the FDA from a regulatory standpoint. And with that, I'll turn it over to him.
Hi, my name is David Huang, and I'm a reviewer in the Division of Spinal Devices at FDA, and I'm here to present to you the agency's perspective on the NEST CC test case for the use of real-world evidence in pre-market and post-market studies for annular closure devices. Next slide. I'm sure you all are familiar with CDRH's mission to promote and protect public health, specifically focusing on ensuring that patients and providers have timely and continued access to safe, effective, and high-quality medical devices, and to provide the public with understandable and accessible science-based information about these products. NEST perfectly aligns with this mission by leveraging our unique position and expertise to systematically utilize real-world evidence and apply advanced analytics to accelerate patients' access to safe and effective medical technologies. I believe it is safe to say that everyone here in attendance is both enthusiastic and hopeful of the benefits of these initiatives. Next slide. As we move forward, the importance of real-world evidence has continued to grow in its impact on our review of medical devices. And within CDRH, these common themes align with many of our strategic priorities, such as simplicity through applying a least burdensome approach, or collaborative communities through the development of NEST. The increased use by industry to highlight and demonstrate clinical experience from real-world evidence has been a welcome addition to expand our knowledge and understanding of new and previously approved cleared devices. Given this growing trend, as you all are probably aware, we released this guidance document regarding the use of real-world evidence that recognizes the use of these alternate solutions or sources of scientific information. Before we move on, though, I'd like to focus a little on two critical points outlined in this document: relevance and reliability. It's my own personal opinion, particularly as a reviewer, that these are the most important elements touched upon in this guidance document. I cannot stress enough the attention that should be placed on these two concepts when choosing to leverage real-world evidence. First, clearly describe why the data is being used is applicable to the risk that's being addressed. This might include a clear demonstration of why the device in your real-world evidence is equivalent or the same as the device that you're applying the data to. Or it might include a demonstration for why the patient population in the data that you are referencing is the same as the patient population defined in your indications for use. Next, there needs to be a demonstration that the data is reliable. This may include many things, such as demonstrating that the data is not being cherry-picked in a retrospective study stating that the analysis was conducted on consecutive patients, or potentially having an independent review board that re-adjudicates adverse event classification. Again, from our perspective, both of these elements are critical when attempting to leverage real-world data during any sort of regulatory decision-making. Next slide, please. Okay, on to the specifics regarding annular closure devices. The Intrinsic Therapeutics team has covered some of what this device does, but I'd like to highlight that this type of device was proposed as a potential alternative to standard of care for a targeted high-risk population, without specifically eliminating the progression to historical options such as fusion if the disease state continues to progress. Annular closure devices are Class 3 devices that require a PMA submission. This means a device requires a standalone set of clinical data to demonstrate a reasonable assurance of its safety and efficacy for the intended use. Traditionally, PMAs have included evaluation of prospective randomized controlled clinical trials, though more recently, we've seen a much more diverse approach, often combining different sources of data or leveraging smaller data sets of prospective data. The limitation often seen regarding real-world data in these types of higher risk devices in pre-market space is the need to review patient-level data, such as a breakdown of adverse events or imaging. It's worth noting that the Barricade device was first of a kind in the US, and while they did not conduct their study here, they did wind up leveraging an outside US perspective randomized trial. This may not fall within sort of the overall real-world evidence definition that we're discussing here today, but it does represent a deviation from previously more common US trials under IDE. Next slide, please. The NEST CC test case involving HealthCore and Intrinsic Therapeutics holds great importance because it has taken the concept of real-world evidence and created a potential real-life application as it relates to a Class 3 product. This represents a critical step towards understanding the use of real-world evidence for spinal devices under this program. A conclusion that could be drawn from this test case regarding the use of real-world evidence in the pre-market space is that it addresses some known limitations from uncertainty or the lack of critical elements available from the data set. As mentioned in the previous presentation, they were unable to track annular defect size, which was critical in this application in identifying these higher risk patients. Another issue would have been the need for not only imaging to address some safety concerns, but that some of the imaging might not have been part of standard of care. In this case, the measurement of the defect size in the imaging protocol would have been potentially extra steps during the clinical care that was not collected sort of from a standard perspective. However, this test case does help inform us of useful clinical data that can be used in the adoption of common data elements for both annular closure devices as well as other spinal devices. We can also translate these same points into the post-market by leveraging important lessons learned from world evidence and registries regarding what types of data could be collected given a specific device type. As typical with any post-market observations, we may use this more consistent data set to inform and impact labeling and future use of the device, such as providing additional instructions or points to consider for surgeons and radiologists. This test case also specifically establishes a link between the administrative's claims data, demographics, and common covariates with other outcomes. This ultimately impacts accessibility to patients, which is pretty much what we're all striving for. Next slide. That concludes our presentations, and I believe that we will all welcome questions and look forward to the discussion.